All right. Thank you, folks, for joining us for our honors colloquium today. I was just going to mention our last honors colloquium of the semester is going to be December 2nd, which is going to be fully on Zoom. Dr. Ben Newman, who is a chief virologist at A&M College Station, who used to be the chair of our biology department, will be speaking to us on SARS-CoV-2 or SARS, something about COVID. And it will be very, very interesting. I probably should remember this title. But today we have the pleasure of Dr. Melinda, who is Vice President for Academic Affairs and Professor of Criminal Justice here at A&M-Texarkana, who's going to be speaking on rethinking the offender reentry paradigm. Dr. Arnold.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. McCashian has just learned something today. So we can all learn something today. It has been a minute since I've actually been in a classroom and done a classroom talk, and I can't tell you how excited I am. And just a plug for any of you who may want to take a criminal justice class in the spring. I am teaching institutional corrections Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 10:50. So if anybody's interested, or you know any friends that are, please invite them. I'm here to talk about offender reentry, and it is something that is near and dear to my heart, something that I've written about extensively, but also something that I've lived, in the sense that I used to work for New Jersey and the New Jersey State Parole Board, and used to work for Dallas County Probation. So here we go. Here we go.
You might have to use the mouse, unfortunately.
I have to
Sorry.
use the mouse.
Yeah.
You have to use the foot.
Oh, you have to let Shannon. There we go. I'm optimistic.
Here we go.
There we go.
Thank you so much. All right. I've got to be quick about this part of the talk because what I really want to focus on is a little later. This is a very long presentation that I'm sort of truncating for our time here. For those of you who don't know what offender reentry is, it is the notion of people going to prison, right? That's the going into prison, and reentering is people leaving prison and coming back to the community. More than 700,000 people a year. It's actually gone down a little bit since this slide was written, but that's a large number of people every year leaving prison and going back. Where are they going back to? They're going back to communities like Texarkana. They're going back to everywhere, right? So really, really important to know that there's a large number of people leaving prison and large number of people coming back to our communities. What it is the process by which people leave prison. And the problem is that over I'd say the last 150 years or so, since we've been thinking about these kinds of things, we still don't really understand what it is or why people, or the ways in which they do it. So I said it happens everywhere, and it absolutely does. There isn't a town or a community that is not impacted by people leaving prison and coming back to the community in some meaningful way. Everybody is impacted in ways big and small, and you'll see that as we move forward. Generally speaking, when you watch the news, you see the murder and mayhem, rape and pillage, right? It's usually the first 10 minutes of the news. Usually there's somebody with a white towel around their neck that you're seeing that's been arrested for something or that's been convicted of something. And so that's what we are generally as a society concerned about, is people going to prison. What we've generally not thought about or given any real thought to is what happens to them when they leave. And the stark reality is that 95% of people who go to prison leave prison. So that's a large number of people. The 5% who don't leave in a body bag. So most people are leaving and coming back, right? So generally, when we talk about offender reentry, we talk about what works. There's a whole, if any of you are CJ majors or know anything about the discipline, there's this whole area of it called what works. And so it's a bunch of literature based on research that's been done about programming and other things that work in terms of preparing offenders, both from a correctional standpoint and from programming to, again, coming back and integrating with society. What we know is that some programs work some of the time, but most programs don't work all of the time, and that should make sense to you folks. There's not a one size fits all. Unfortunately, the correctional system or any of our social service networks or systems are not in a position to be able to serve each person individually. So what we do is we develop programming that's based on almost like based on typologies, right? These notions of what will work for the most people. The problem is the people for whom that does not work, we have issues. So it's a hodgepodge of programs. There's really not a system. There's really not a thread. The research has been iterative, like it is in most disciplines. It's changed over time. We know that some things work better than others, but we keep trying. And so what you'll find from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, town to town, that everybody employs or uses something a little bit different. So it's really hard to understand from a research standpoint what works best. So we incarcerate more people than any industrialized nation. You all should know that, or if you don't know that, then I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell you that. It's true. It used to be Russia. It's us. We take that. There are a bunch of reasons for why this is the case. Part of it is sentencing, changes in how sentencing legislation has occurred both at the federal and the local levels over time. In the 80s, we went through a get tough on crime era, and so the sentences that we employed were very, very punitive, which sent people to prison for more people to prison for very long periods of time. So we backed away from that a little bit because we figured out that, guess what, prison doesn't really solve the problems that we hoped or thought they would solve. But sentencing is in large part responsible for this. We've got the politicization of crime. If any of you pay any attention to politics, you know that crime is usually, if it's not the #1 agenda item, it's certainly in the top 3. And everybody's got an opinion on what we should do about the bad people. We've got the war on drugs. Also, you're all, most of you in the room are too young for Nancy Reagan and Just Say No. But hey, listen, that was how we were going to fight the war on crime, or the war on drugs, was to say, just say no. And what we know is that a lot of the legislation that was passed as a result of it actually caused more damage. We've got economics. We know that people engage in crime, but also do so for a variety of reasons. Many of them are economic. Up until relatively recently, we weren't talking about increasing minimum wage rates. We weren't talking about child care support for everyone who has children. And so we have people who felt, rightly or wrongly, felt that they had no other place to turn. And so they often, not always, but often would turn to crime. And then we have inequalities. We have inequalities in sentencing. We have inequalities in race. We have inequalities in socioeconomic status. We have inequalities in the way that our laws are passed, and more importantly, the way our laws are applied. And so when you have all of those things, you create, it's a perfect storm, if you will, right? A recipe for disaster. It's stunning. People do these bad things. They're sentenced to prison terms. They go to prison, and our expectation is poof, they're in there for as long as they're going to be in there, and then they're going to come out, and everything's going to be okay. Well, obviously, that's not the case, and that's not how life works. People go into prison with a whole host of issues that aren't necessarily rectified, treated, or even managed while they're in prison, and guess what? They leave with those things after a period of time has passed. And then you have everything that happens on the back end, right? Which is really what we also have when people leave prison are these things called collateral consequences. Some of you may have known that we've had 1 or 2 political elections that were literally would have been decided by people who had been in prison but did not have the opportunity to vote. In some cases it went in one direction, and in some cases it went in another. But we know that people who are felons, and by the way, there's not one law or one federal law, it's all done by state and local jurisdictions. But we know that each state is different in how they treat offenders with whether or not they can vote. But a collateral consequence of incarceration in some states is the inability to vote. So you've got extensive voter disenfranchisement. You've got people whose mothers in particular, but fathers too, whose parental rights are terminated while they're in prison. You can, just FYI, you can use felony as a grounds for divorce. Just saying, inability to hold public office. There are people who cannot hold public office if they've been convicted of a felony, cannot get federal assistance. can't get certain licenses. My favorite story that I used to tell my classes is when I worked in New Jersey. I used to go to all of our prisons there. The maximum security prison used to have a cosmetology program. Now, the irony of a maximum security prison having a cosmetology program should not be lost on you. Maximum security prisons are where people go for very, very long periods of time. But okay, they had a cosmetology program, then people would leave, and because you were a felon in New Jersey, you could not own a weapon. Well, scissors are a weapon, so they could not even then practice their just the one of the ironies. So here we go. We need to take a micro and a macro level to what offender reentry is in order to understand it best. And it is much more complicated than you might imagine. So on the micro level, all the things that you see on this graph are things that impact on an individual level, a person's ability to reentry or to reenter. So you have housing. Many offenders didn't have housing before they were incarcerated. So if they don't have connections with people on the outside when they leave, they couch hop, right? But in order to leave prison and come back to the community, if you're doing so on parole, which is supervision, you have to have a place to live. So if you don't have housing, you're in trouble. We know that the single greatest predictor of success when people leave prison and come back to the community is education and employment. Either one, they're interchangeable. We know that if people were educated before they went in, them having a job when they come out is optimal. We know that if they weren't educated before they went in and they are able to obtain education while in prison, their chances are better coming out. But we know in all cases that if you're educated or you're employed in some way, you're going to have a better chance of success. But until relatively recently, there was something called the black box. Don't know if any of you ever seen it when you filled out an application somewhere, but the black box used to say, if you've been convicted of a felony, don't bother, right? Until very recently, that was the case. What you see now is more businesses giving people opportunities to at least fill out the application and come in for an interview. But that was a huge, huge change that's only happened in, I would say, the last 3 to 5 years. Families and children are significantly impacted by their parent or a sibling or a relative going to prison. 80% of women who go to prison have a child that they're often leaving behind. And because most people in prison are men, right? The majority of men are leaving a child behind. So you have all of these psychological, social, intellectual, emotional traumas associated with a child being left behind either by a mother or a father. And then you have the parent who's in prison and has to endure the separation from the child. You've got physical health. We know that people who go to prison are physically less well than the rest of us. And so they go in with a variety of diseases and maladies that are treated while they're in prison. That's required by federal law. But what you find out is that they were so sick and they were so most likely not well treated prior that dealing with those diseases is extraordinarily difficult. So they leave prison often with a bunch of medications and a bunch of other things that they need to get, but they can't afford. But mental health. If any of you are in counseling, you probably know a little something about co-occurring disorders, which is usually the coalescence of mental health and substance abuse deficits that people often have. One of the challenges in treating these is figuring out which came first. Is it the mental health problem that begat substance abuse, or substance abuse which begat mental health? But you have people on the individual level dealing with all of these things, not to mention, of course, the issues related to the crime that they have committed. On the macro level, we've got a whole other level of concerns and struggles that people deal with. I could give you an entire lecture on risk needs assessment and how we evaluate the risk that people pose to communities and the needs that they have. But what we know is people with higher needs require more effort, require more involvement and engagement, and the degree to which society is able to support that through treatment, through programming, through capacity, through funding is pretty minimal. We have people who are criminals who are who express resilience, right? That despite everything, in spite of everything, they are able to go to prison, come back, and be successful. But what we also know is that people often go to prison, come back to society, and are able to desist. They're able to say, you know what, that was it. That's a one and done for me. Or that's a 5 and done for me. But that I have within me the capacity to not commit crime again. And if you know anything about crime, what you also know is that as people get older, they are less likely to commit crime. Basically, you age out of crime. So notice those. Stigma. There's a huge stigma associated with being an offender. It's the scarlet O, as it were, right? And it's something that people wear, but it's manifested in a number of ways. And when I say wear, I don't mean physically wear, but they wear it intellectually, they wear it emotionally. They wear it when they try to get a job. They wear it when they try to get a driver's license, when they try to get an insurance card, when they try to find their birth certificate. And all of these things are not always necessarily available to folks, and so it's very much a struggle. You have public opinion, people's opinions about crime, about the death penalty, about punishment. And those impact people's ability to engage in a concerted way. You have gender. Women and men are treated fundamentally differently within the criminal justice system and also within prison itself. So when they come back out, their needs are different, the way they engage with treatment is different, the way they reconnect with their families is different. It's just very, very different. And then you have a community who must either be accepting or not accepting of the people coming back. And because, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, you had large numbers of young men between the ages of, say, 19 and 25, leaving communities in droves and being incarcerated due to some of those sentencing issues that I was talking to you about. So you have whole communities left with women who are picking up the roles and responsibilities of men, and then the men come back, right? Because remember, 95% of people who go in come back. And so when they come back, they forget that time has passed. Time has continued onward. And all these people have often moved on with, maybe not without them, but they've moved on. And so how do you reintegrate? How do you take, I was removed for 5 years, because 5 years, that's about the average time of a prison sentence. I come back, things have changed, right? So how the community engages, the degree to which it's able to accept or not accept the person coming back. So this is just the general graphic for you of how it works with micro into macro into community level variables. So what I constructed when I wrote my book, and this was a book that I originally wrote in 2013, and a book that I'm updating now with a friend of mine out of Florida. And what we looked at was trying to re-engage and rethink how we talk about offender reentry. And so what we wanted to look at is an integrated theory that helped us get through this process. And I'm just going to skip through these because I'm running out of time. What I want to talk about is the identity of the offender. It in and of itself is probably the single greatest predictor for the success or not that a person has when they come back to the community. So as you might imagine, an identity of an offender is usually a fairly negative one. At some point in their life, they've been told no. Could be at sentencing. It could have been before that by their parents. It could have been in the classroom. It could have been because of a lengthy criminal record. It could have been because they have a mental health or substance abuse deficits. It could be for a whole bunch of reasons. But at some point or another, they have been told no. And so they have, over time, developed what we consider to be a negative self-identity. And what we know is that those identities drastically impact civic engagement, the degree to which people are engaged in the community, whether they vote, whether they take part in communal activities, whether they go to church or synagogue or mosque or whatever, right? The degree to which they are engaged with others. And so we know that there are the higher the level of negative identity, the lower the level of civic engagement. And so what we need to take place is an identity transformation. Offenders have to rethink and reimagine themselves. They have been told by virtue of a sentence that they have erred against society. And corrections, think about the notion of corrections. A prison is supposed to be a place of correction. It is, if any of you have ever been to a prison, that is the last thing it is. It is an issue of custody and control with a little bit of, a little pepper sprinkling of a class here or there. But there's neither capacity nor funding to be able to support the level of correction that is likely likely necessary. So you have identity transformation that's got to take place in order for offenders to rethink and reevaluate how they think about themselves, let alone how they think about the world that they're coming back to. And so they do that through literally rewriting the scripts of their lives. They do it through positive narratives of taking what has happened that's been negative and transforming it into something that is positive. Not accepting responsibility for their actions, but in fact doing just that, accepting responsibility and recognizing how it can change them and make them better humans. This is an incredibly arduous task, folks. Think about yourself and maybe something that you're not proud of, or something, something that has been hurtful in your own life, and how you might reconstruct that in a way that helps you move forward. Maybe you've done that before, but it's very, very difficult. So they do it through rewriting these scripts about themselves. They do it through rituals. Rituals that support each other. AA, great example. Any other programming that they have in criminal justice is usually related to these kinds of rituals that are generally group supportive, but also elevate individuals. Rites of passages, graduations, positive things, getting a job, finishing your GED or finishing a degree. Those kinds of things. So again, I'm going to pass this. I kind of said this.
It's a microcosm of life.
It is. It
Never enough
absolutely
time.
is. So when folks are able to reimagine their scripts, rewrite those narratives, they can't do that in a vacuum. We've got to have a system that supports their ability to be pro-social and to engage in pro-social behaviors and to move beyond where they are. And so I'm very critical of my own system. I'm very critical of the own work that I used to do in the area of probation and parole when I talk about integrating a strengths-focused approach, because that is not at all what the system does. The system is extraordinarily punitive, and people succeed despite the system or in spite of the system, not because of the system. The system is created to implement or to instill barriers and impediments to success. And I'm sorry to say that. It's not cynicism, it's reality. And so what we have to do is recreate this dynamic. We have to reframe the paradigm. Strengths-focused approach is actually a social work theory and terminology that is very beneficial. Anybody in social work would know that people have strengths. Everybody's got a strength. Even Hannibal Lecter had a strength of some kind. Not sure what it is, but he had one. And so the idea is to think through what people's strengths are and figure out how to leverage those to motivate people, right, to do what you need them to do as a parole or probation officer. And that is to get a job, right? To educate, to go through your program, to be a tax-paying citizen, right? To ultimately get off parole. Well, this requires us to completely reframe how parole and probation work. Most officers don't collaborate. They don't often take great heed with assessments. They are often rude with offenders. They don't engage properly with them. They don't leverage the benefits of psychology and social work and understanding how to motivate people. In fact, most of the time, they're not interested in those things, and that is a darn shame. Because if we had people who were doing those things, we'd have much greater success from the people who are taking part in those things. Case management opportunities or possibilities in terms of leveraging behavioral contracts. Knowing what motivates an individual is always good, leveraging getting them to get done what needs to get done. But it takes time to know people, and it takes time to figure out what those things are. Empowering people through the stages of change, that would be Prochaska and Di Clemente, and understanding where people are in their notions of their revising their script are extraordinarily important in moving them through this process. Asking people why they do things, not checking things off a list, but actually having a conversation, having an engagement with the person to find these things out. Leveraging human capital in a pro-social way. By, you're all students and you came to this institution, maybe you've been at other places. Sometimes big, large places are hard to navigate. How do you know where to pay your bill? How do you know how to register for classes? How do you know how to do all of these things? Well, if you didn't have somebody to help you, or you didn't know, maybe if you knew where to find the information, you could do it. But offenders don't often know, and because the systems in criminal justice and social service organizations with which they partner are so fragmented, many times people have no clue where to start. And so if you don't know where to start, and you're frustrated when you do start, a lot of the times, you just wash your hands, right? Wash your hands of it and say, not gonna do it. So.
James would like to enter the Zoom room as well.
Sorry, James.
Well, he's not.
I'm sorry.
He'll be okay.
So I wanted to show this slide to you in particular, because this gives you the big differences between problem-oriented supervision, which is what we do now in probation and parole, and strength-based supervision. Problem-oriented supervision, we've got all these hierarchical relationships and all these, everything is very, very autocratic in that way. We've got lots of people telling you how bad you are for all the bad things you've done, and how if you don't do these things, you're gonna get in trouble and you're gonna go back to prison. Which, of course, if somebody's always telling you you're bad, you may become very defensive and not be open to engaging, right? Often minimizes people's capabilities and emphasizes their problems. It's very problem-oriented. Strengths-based supervision is just the opposite. It's about bringing groups of people together. Often there are teams that work together to help a single person figure out how to get that birth certificate, or how to get that driver's license, or how to get that CEO license, or how to get that job. You've got accountability, which is encouraged and emphasized, but it's encouraged and emphasized through positive action. It's telling people that if you do this, these are all the things, positive things that can happen as a result. It maximizes capabilities, minimizes problems, but I need you to understand that it also very fully and clearly emphasizes accountability. It is not saying that because you did this bad thing, you get to get off if you do this. It's not saying that at all. What it is saying is that you did this, it happened at this time, you've been to prison, you're out or coming out, and these are the things we want to focus, because we need to be looking forward. We need not be looking backward. Gracious. So this is what the whole thing looks like when it's put together. Okay, so we need to transform people's identities and get them to move from very negative orientations of self to positive orientations of self through rewriting those scripts and narratives about who they are and how they've ended up where they are and where they want to go moving forward. One way to do that, one primary way to do that is through a strengths-based approach to probation, parole, supervision. And getting people to understand, both the people who work in the system and the clients whom they serve, that accountability is paramount and foundational to this, but that at some point we have to leave the past behind and we have to be able to move forward. If you've done all these things, if you're able to do all these things, what you end up with is an altered identity. The offender is able to integrate. The offender is able to become a tax-paying citizen, a member of the PTA, whatever it is. It takes time. And that's what I have. And I look, right, 9
Well
minutes
done.
left.
Well done, well done. All right, we have some time for questions. Thank you very much. Leslie, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say there's like,
We have a few questions in the chat, I think.
I have a question as
Thank
well.
you for bringing that up.
Dr. Cantrell, while we are looking at the
Yes.
comments.
Sure. Good morning, Dr. Arnold. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We're so really blessed to have your expertise on the criminal justice system. I know in my home field of feminism, some of the language is transitioning from the criminal justice system to the criminal legal system, really challenging that idea of justice. And I think you touched on that quite a bit in your talk today. My question has to do about what you spoke at length around identity transformation, the reentry, reframing paradigms, rewriting scripts and narratives to get to this sort of space of altered identity. And undoubtedly, I think that includes the rhetorics and the language that we use to discuss incarcerated people. So I was surprised and curious about your repetitive use of offender in this talk rather than formerly incarcerated person.
Mhm.
What do you think?
No, you're absolutely right. No, you are absolutely right. I am in this talk using a term that is often used in a degradative way. You're absolutely right. I'm engaging in the behavior that I am telling everyone not to do.
Fair enough.
Yes, you're right.
Let me, Kevin, I know we asked a few questions in the chat. Sorry, Kevin, we didn't see that.
Offenders are generally treated as less than human, which absolutely affects their self-image, self-worth, and even their hope they can do more. Couldn't agree more. Generally, a better reentry process leads to lower recidivism rates. You're absolutely right. So we are addressing recidivism. You absolutely can address recidivism if you are thinking through how to better assist people with reentry. People reentering well are doing all the things they need to do to minimize the likelihood that they're going to recommit a crime.
Bill, you had a question?
Yeah, I noticed there's a lot of language of theater in your talk here. There was stages of performance and theaters of performance and scripts and things like that. And I wondered if you'd ever heard of Shakespeare Behind Bars.
No, I haven't.
I'll tell you about it sometime. A former colleague of mine is
Oh, wait, isn't it
Pendleton.
No, is it at Pennsylvania University? Is it
No,
University?
it's all over now.
Okay.
Yeah. But I went to a performance once, and it's first of all, it's quite a feat to try to get prisoners to rehearse because things happen. They get transferred or they get put in solitary and moved around. Anyhow, I saw this amazing production of Coriolanus, and then we talked to the cast afterwards. So these were all men, and so like the old Shakespearean company, they had to play all the different roles. And there have been a lot of studies done on this thing now, and turns out there's a low recidivism rate. What was fabulous to me about it was talking to the actors after the performance. The experience of being in a play like that, where they had to play multiple roles, victim and murderer and whatnot, men and women, really help them reimagine themselves. It's fascinating, yeah.
There's several, I don't know that one in particular, but there's several programs like that. There used to be one out of Penn that would bring theater to a local maximum security for local Pennsylvania. Maximum security prison where they would play our roles. There's a host of programs like that.
All right, I'm afraid we're probably out of time
That's
for
fine.
questions, but let's go to the bank, Dr. Arnold.
Thank you. You may email me, please do.
Extra before she leaves.
I
Thank you
would
very much.
love to chat.